So Jesus walks on the water. Let's get into that. Like much of the Gospels, Matthew's Gospel, the bit that we've heard this morning, and please do turn to it, it's on the page that you're on at the moment, perhaps. The first sentence begins, "and immediately." It's important when listening to any period of the Gospels that we know what happened before and what happened afterwards, because on a Sunday morning we are just going to get a short extract. So what's just been happening? Well, as ever, a lot. We just heard about the execution of John the Baptist. Herod has had him executed. When Jesus hears of this, we're told, he himself took a boat and he slipped away to try to find a place by himself. After all, John was his cousin. But he couldn't get away. The crowd found him, a large crowd gathered, in fact, about 5,000 people, Matthew says. So he spent the day teaching, surrounded by people, when actually what he wanted was to be alone. There was a mysterious happening towards the end of the day when food was brought for them all. It didn't really seem to be enough on the face of it, just a few loaves and fishes. But in fact, everyone was fed, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers at the end. So at the end of that day again, Jesus tries to get away from the crowds, and this is where we pick up the story today. Who can blame him? He's bereaved, he's sad. He sends away even his closest friends. He insists that the disciples go. Notice that in the gospel. He sends them away. And now he has some time to himself to pray on the mountain. Some time to think and pray. Perhaps the death of his cousin confronts him with the cost of speaking as they have been doing. Speaking truth to power has cost John his life and will cost Jesus his. The Greek phrase is "at the fourth watch," translated here into English as "early in the morning." We hear that the boat the disciples are in is in trouble. The disciples have been battling all night. The fourth watch is just before dawn. The Sea of Galilee, for those of you who visited it, you'll know, it's enormous. It's not a quiet lake, but a huge expanse of water, still to this day prone to storms and high winds. Jesus finds them in this storm. Matthew describes this in terms of the Psalms and the book of Job, that it is only God, as Job says, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled on the waves of the sea. Jesus does what only God can do as one of the ways to show, to proclaim that the presence and action of Jesus Christ is the same as the presence and action of God. There are echoes too here of the Exodus, when God comes to the enslaved people of Israel in Egypt on the fourth watch, that is, the early morning. God's saving power comes only after great struggle, perhaps all night. In this tumultuous situation full of needy crowds, Jesus' grief at the violent death of a brave and close cousin, disciples once again getting themselves into trouble and needing help, and the natural world doing what it does, providing the grief-stricken, stormy context for the presence and action of God. Into all this tumult comes a recognizable, intimate conversation between Peter and Jesus. "Don't be afraid, it is I," says Jesus. Again, a phrase highly resonant and rich from Isaiah, from the prophet Isaiah. That's the phrase that God uses to speak to the people. It is I. Recognize me. See me. Notice what happens when I'm here. Peter, as ever, jumps in, hardly letting him finish. "Okay, if it is you, prove it. And tell me to do something impossible." "Sure, fill your boots," says Jesus. That's not in the Greek, by the way. "Sure, go for it. If being commanded to do something impossible is the proof that you need, let's just see how this goes." Peter jumps in, starts sinking, and calls out, "Save me." In my 20s, I was in a production of the Frank Lesser musical currently playing at the Bridge Theatre, Guys and Dolls. A 3-week run in a professional theatre, I played Sarah Brown, a Salvation Army sergeant from the Save a Soul mission. Sarah is the object of a bet from a gambler called Sky Masterson. Actually, Sky Masterson, the production I was in, was played by Alexander Armstrong, who you can see every day on Pointless. The gambler is called Sky Masterson, who takes her to Havana, gets her drunk, and, well, I won't spoil the ending. Notwithstanding the point that this was way before I thought of being ordained, and so was in the end a strange prophecy for someone who did eventually go into the ministry, it is, in my opinion, for people who like musicals, the best musical of all time. Without question. The music is joyous, jazzy, bluesy, and the best song is not sung by Sarah or Sky, but by a gambler called Nicely Nicely Johnson. The song is Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat. It's riotous, and the current cast at the Bridge Theatre bring the house down with it. The musical is full of characters who are boat rockers, including Sarah, who's surrounded by gamblers, saves the mission in the end. And so although the message of that hit song is that on your way to heaven, you should probably sit down in case you rock the boat, the whole of the musical's plot indicates that rocking the boat is good. So here's my problem with today's gospel. This gospel will be preached all over the world today as the set gospel for the day. It will be preached in great cathedrals, in tiny community centres. It will be studied in fields, in chapels, on beaches, and in boats. It is, even on the cursory few minutes we've just spent looking at it, a tumultuous gospel, full of emotion, courage, grief, fear, and a sense that battling the elements, that surviving the events of life together is in itself the potent context for the saving presence and action of God. The faith of Peter and the others is neither perfect, but it's not absent either. It's described as little. I relate to that. I don't know if you do. It's little. And the storm, heavy with the Psalms for any of Jesus' contemporaries or the first readers and writers of the Gospels, subsides, echoing Psalms 89, 107, the book of Job, and many other instances in the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Scriptures, where the image and language of storms and peril and salvation and drowning is everywhere. If you're looking for a way to describe the relationship between the divine and human, between God and people, then this image of drowning, rescuing, storms, and high wind is a regularly repeated motif throughout the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. It's a way of describing what a life of faith is like. And at the heart of this story is an epiphany, the manifestation of Jesus doing what only God can do, walking on the waters and rescuing the one who is drowning, and identifying himself in the way that only God speaks. It is I. When faith is little, then courage is grown from stories like these. And both our readings today, the gospel story and also Paul's letter to the Romans, the theme running through both of them is salvation. And Paul even says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But here's the thing. Maybe some people, maybe some here, worry about the literal possibility of this, a person walking over water. Am I asked to believe this in order to be part of this place or part of this community? It's not prescribed or required to have any sort of set statement regarding this. Neither should any church ask for it. But for me, I'm always suspicious of closed, absolutist statements taken out of context. We do it to Paul, St. Paul, all the time. And to be honest, he doesn't really help. But he's said Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Not everyone who calls on the name of the Lord is saved in this life. Next Sunday, we're holding a special service here to mark the 250th anniversary of the baptism of the abolitionist Kobna Ottawa Kukuano. I hope that as many of the current St. James's community can be here to honour a previous member of our congregation. In his book, which we're also reading together online during that week, he describes his own kidnapping and trafficking from West Africa to Grenada, and along the way, as was common, enslaved people on the same ship were thrown overboard on this terrible journey. More than 40 migrants drowned off the coast of Libya last Thursday. 6 people drowned yesterday in the English Channel, having been duped by people traffickers into making such a perilous journey towards a new life. Searching for a new life, they lost theirs. As a Christian, and with the privilege of being a preacher, I want to challenge, even oppose, over-literal interpretations of this gospel story. Because although that might look faithful, it in fact reveals a description of a God that I think is made more in the image of humans than allowed to be the God that God is. What do I mean by that? If the lesson from this gospel story where Jesus walks across the water to the boat, Peter jumps in to walk on water too, then sinks, and Jesus saves him. If the lesson from this is that we must believe that this is historically accurate, and therefore if we call on God and have enough faith, we will be saved, it has consequences for what we believe about God and how we live as Christians in the world today. The logic of that literal reading leads us to the conclusion that some people are saved by God when they call, Peter for instance, but some are left willfully by God to suffer and drown. I can't imagine the force with which people will have wanted to be saved who drowned in the Channel yesterday, and countless others in peril not only on the sea, but in a million different shackled circumstances. What has happened to them is wickedness and has no place in a moral universe that comes from an overly literal reading of the gospel that talks about salvation in only that way. For us to call upon God, yes, of course, I do that every day. For strength, for help, knowing that I am utterly dependent. But to worry that this all means your faith has to be strong enough to walk on water before you can talk to God or ask to be saved leads us down a damaging path where, despite our best intentions, we put ourselves into the place of God, assess and judge who can be saved, and become overly concerned with our own salvation. Salvation is a potent and important theme for Christians, but we mistake it if we think it's purely a journey for the individual. Salvation in the Gospels carries the meaning of healing and living. It means different things to different people then, and the path is different that leads to the life of Christ depending on where we're starting from. And the great danger for reflective Christians who often worry about believing things too passionately or staking ourselves on any one truth, the besetting sin of good-hearted, progressive, liberal, if you want to accept the labels, churches like this one, the besetting sin is that we somehow convince ourselves that if we just work a bit harder or be more pure or have more faith, then the world will be perfect. And we're consumed by anxiety because it isn't. Christians can get stuck in the social, political, environmental analysis, so eager to confront the unthinking and remote religious practices of the past, eager to remain relevant. But this is a path not to deeper trust in God or faith, but to what we might call a congealing self-perfection that makes us risk-averse, consumed by anxiety, hard on ourselves about all the wrong things. The way to combat this is to immerse ourselves in the deepest possible gospel truth, the greatest possible story of God, the widest possible perspective. God's eye's view is so different as we hear in the tumultuous events of this gospel, the joy of living in the abundance of 12 baskets of leftovers, devastation at the violence and selfishness of which each one of us here is capable, the confrontation of abuse of power, the utter grace of always being able to begin again, the choking relief that salvation is possible. This gospel is much more true than taking it literally. It's more challenging, more powerful, more transformational than any supernatural trick. Because this gospel invites us to trust in God. This is all about me and my salvation, but never only about me. I am only saved with you. Interdependent on all that lives and has lived, I am only saved with you, never without you. And saved, not by all the work we do, even if we think we're doing it for God, not saved by works, but by costly grace. And our job as human beings is to put ourselves in the way of that costly grace that has at its heart the fundamental mechanism for living. Confession of our self-centeredness, a renewed dependence on God, an open-hearted cry for help, forgiveness, and yes, starting again. Always as if it's the first day, starting again. Jesus' irresistible invitation to live like this as a disciple, a lifelong learner of and immersed in the spiritual life, is fundamentally rooted in that character of salvation. The two greatest crises facing the planet in these days, the environmental crisis and the forced migration and trafficking of human beings, teach us what salvation is. Because in Christ, I am not saved alone in competition or opposition from you. I am only saved with all that lives and has lived. In reply to James, the saint who gives his name to this church, in the gospel, in reply to James, Jesus talked about that salvation as costly and together. Jesus said to James, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. This same cup is the cup that Jesus begged God to remove from him in the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a cup of suffering. This cup of suffering, when we share it, we choose to be at one with the suffering of Christ and the suffering of the world. And so today, we take action together, as at every Eucharist we will share bread and wine or a blessing, and you're free to receive any of these. It's for you. Symbolically, we share that cup of suffering and the bread of heaven made manifest in the world in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And this cup which we will share today, some of us, and symbolically all of us, was made at the same time as this church. This cup was made in 1684. And since that day, people have shared this cup, and that includes, without doubt, Ottobah Cugoano, who worshipped here regularly in the 1780s. This cup, the cup of Christ's suffering, Ottawa's cup of suffering. We deliberately use the historic chalice not as some sort of bland reenactment. Don't worry, we're not trying to be the Sealed Knot Society reenacting 17th century events for our own pleasure, but precisely because this physical cup connects us with all that lives and has lived. It's a cup of Christ's suffering and holds the requirement for repentance in it, for costly grace. For slave owners drank from it alongside abolitionists. And it's not apparent, nor can it be, the wide range of sympathies or experiences of all those here today who will share it too. It is the new wine of the kingdom, or better to say in ecological terms perhaps, the kingdom that is ahead of us, when we know fully as we are known that we are at one with all that lives and has lived, salvation. It is freely offered to enable each of us and together to dive deeply into this gospel, to bring good news into tumultuous and emotional times, now as they were then, to be, when we need to be, boat rockers, as Christ was. To set off into one theologian called in 1930s Germany, the storm of events. And to trust together in the God who, in the words of Psalm 107, will bring us to the haven where we would be after the storm. The cost of this is high. There will be times you feel you are drowning as we oppose the traffickers, or the religious interpreters, or the policy makers even, or become overwhelmed too at our own complicity and the limits of our own individual power. Our calling, as we battle in the boat, is to let God be God. Listen for the voice who doesn't give us a to-do list, but asks us to recognize and look even when the wind is high. And, yes, set off into the storm of events, knowing our salvation is with all that lives and has lived in a Christ-shaped, Christ-like life that is open to all. Amen.